The rain had not ceased for 3 days, and the great stone manor of Ashford Hall seemed to absorb the gloom like a living creature fed on sorrow. Within its walls, the staff moved with hushed efficiency, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets that had witnessed generations of pride and decay. The kitchen, however, hummed with a different energy, a frantic, desperate sort of movement that spoke of fear more than purpose. "He's refused again," Mrs. Holloway announced, her broad face flushed as she burst through the kitchen door, carrying yet another untouched tray. The roasted pheasant sat in its bed of herbs, the sauce congealed and cold, the vegetables limp with neglect. 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since His Grace has taken more than a few bites of anything we've prepared. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken worry. They had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the county had heard them. How the Duke of Ashford, Lucian Blackwood, had returned from London a changed man. How the engagement that was to have secured his family's alliance with the powerful Weatherby estate had been shattered in a single night of scandal. How Lady Arabella Weatherby, the woman he was to have married, had been discovered in the conservatory with his own cousin, Lord Edmund Hale, their treachery illuminated by moonlight and witnessed by half the ton's most vicious gossips. The humiliation had been absolute. The revenge, it seemed, was being exacted upon himself. "He'll waste away," muttered the head cook, a thin man whose hands trembled as he wiped them on his apron. "We'll all be turned out if he dies of starvation under our watch." In the corner of the kitchen, where the light from the great hearth barely reached, a young woman stood washing dishes in a basin of steaming water. Thea Winters had been at Ashford Hall for only 6 months, hired as a scullery maid when the harvest had failed on her father's tenant farm, and the family had needed every spare coin. She was quiet, unremarkable in the way servants were expected to be, easily overlooked, efficiently invisible. But her hands moved with a particular grace over the pottery, and her eyes, when she allowed herself to look up, held a thoughtfulness that suggested depths unplumbed by her station. She had seen the Duke only twice since his return. Once, through a rain-streaked window, as he rode his black stallion across the moors with such reckless speed that she'd feared he sought to throw himself from the cliffs. And once, in passing, when she'd been carrying linens through the corridor and he'd emerged from the library like a ghost, his eyes so hollow and cold that she'd pressed herself against the wall, certain he would not even register her presence. He hadn't. He'd walked past her as though she were merely another shadow in a house full of them. "What does he want, then?" asked one of the kitchen maids, her voice cracking with frustration. "We've prepared everything his steward requested. The finest cuts, the richest sauces. He wants nothing," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost pitying. "That's the heart of it. A man who wants nothing is a man already half in the grave." Thea's hand stilled in the water. She thought of her own father after her mother had died of fever, how he'd sat at their small table, staring at the food she'd prepared, unable to bring fork to mouth until she'd changed everything, had made the simple stew her mother used to prepare, had set the table the way her mother had done, had somehow reached through his grief with the language of memory and care that transcended words. "Perhaps," Thea heard herself say, her voice so soft she wasn't certain anyone would hear. "Perhaps he doesn't want what's finest. Perhaps he wants what's true." The kitchen fell silent. Every face turned toward her, and Thea felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized she'd spoken aloud, that she'd dared to offer an opinion in a domain far above her station. Mrs. Holloway's eyes narrowed, but there was curiosity there too, and something else, the desperate gleam of a woman who'd run out of other options. "And what would you know of what a duke wants, girl?" Thea swallowed hard, but she'd come too far to retreat now. "Nothing of what a duke wants, ma'am. But I know what a grieving man needs. My father." She stopped, uncertain whether her small tragedy held any relevance in this great house of aristocratic sorrows. "My father couldn't eat for weeks after my mother passed, until I made him the simple things she used to make: bread and butter, soup with vegetables from her garden, things that tasted of home, of before." The head cook scoffed. "His Grace doesn't want peasant food. He's rejected preparations from chefs trained in France, Italy. Let her try." Everyone turned to stare at Mrs. Holloway, whose face had settled into an expression of grim determination. What harm can it do now? Another refused tray is simply another refused tray. But if there's even the smallest chance— She looked at Thea with an intensity that made the young woman's breath catch. "Can you cook, girl? Truly cook, not just scrub pots?" Thea thought of her mother's kitchen, of the hundreds of meals she'd prepared for her father and younger brothers after the fever had taken the woman who'd taught her everything about turning simple ingredients into comfort, into love made tangible. "Yes, ma'am. I can cook." "Then tonight, you'll prepare His Grace's dinner. Something simple, as you said. Something true." Mrs. Holloway's voice hardened. "But understand this. If he refuses what you make, you'll be the one to face his steward's questions. I'll not have my position here put at risk for a scullery maid's presumption." Thea nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird desperate for escape. She dried her hands on her apron and moved toward the great wooden work table where the finest ingredients in the county lay arrayed like offerings to an indifferent god. But she walked past them all. Instead, she went to the humble stores kept for the servants' meals. She selected potatoes still dusty with earth, carrots with their greens still attached, onions that had hung in the cellar since autumn. She found a piece of beef that was good, but not extravagant, the kind of cut her mother would have chosen at market. Honest meat, not pampered into tenderness, but requiring skill and time to coax out its flavor. As she worked, the kitchen around her faded into inconsequence. Her hands moved with the certainty of memory, of 1,000 meals prepared with love as the primary seasoning. She browned the beef slowly, letting it develop a crust that would hold its essence. She added the vegetables not in precise portions, but by feel, by instinct. She poured in stock made that morning from bones and scraps, added herbs from the kitchen garden, thyme and rosemary, bay leaf and black pepper, and let it all simmer together until the kitchen filled with an aroma so fundamentally comforting that the other servants paused in their work, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. It was not elegant, it was not refined. It was food that spoke of hearth and home, of hands that cared more about nourishment than performance. It was, Thea thought, as she ladled the stew into a simple bowl and set it on a tray with thick slices of bread. She'd watched the baker pull from the oven that morning. True. Mrs. Holloway inspected the tray with an expression caught between skepticism and hope. "Well, it's different, I'll grant you that. Though whether His Grace will grant you anything but dismissal remains to be seen." She nodded to one of the footmen. "Take it up, and you," she said, fixing Thea with a stern look. "You'll wait here for word." Thea waited. The kitchen resumed its evening rhythm around her, but she stood apart from it, her hands folded in her apron, her heart racing with an anxiety she couldn't fully explain. She had cooked countless meals, had fed her family for years, but never had so much weight rested on something as simple as stew. In her mind, she saw the Duke's hollow eyes, that look of a man who'd already departed from life while his body still drew breath, and she prayed, though she'd never been particularly devout, that somehow, impossibly, she'd managed to speak to whatever small part of him still wanted to be reached. The minutes stretched like hours. The kitchen maids began preparing the servants' dinner. The scullery boy hauled in more water for the washing up. The world continued its mundane turning, while Thea stood frozen, waiting for judgment. When the footman finally returned, his face was unreadable. He set the tray down on the work table, and Thea's heart sank. The bowl was still full, the bread untouched, another failure to add to the growing collection. But then she saw it. The spoon, resting in the bowl, bore traces of broth. The bread had been broken, a piece missing. And the footman, his voice carefully neutral in the way of servants who'd learned to deliver both good news and bad with the same inflection, said, "His Grace requests the cook who prepared this meal to be sent to the small drawing room immediately." The kitchen erupted into whispered chaos. Mrs. Holloway's face had gone pale. Sent to the drawing room? A scullery maid? That's highly irregular. His Grace was quite clear in his instruction, ma'am. Every eye in the kitchen fixed on Thea, who felt as though the floor had become unsteady beneath her feet. Dukes did not summon scullery maids to drawing rooms. That sort of thing simply didn't happen, not in the natural order of the world, unless it was for punishment. Unless she'd somehow offended him more deeply than mere refusal, had committed some unintentional transgression in her presumption to think she could reach him where trained chefs had failed. "Go on, then," Mrs. Holloway said, though her voice had softened slightly. "Change your apron at least. And for God's sake, girl, keep your eyes down and speak only when spoken to." Thea's fingers fumbled with the ties of her soiled apron, replacing it with a clean one kept for such impossible occasions. She smoothed her dark hair, aware that strands had escaped from beneath her cap during the cooking, aware that she must look every inch the servant she was, plain, humble, utterly out of place in the refined spaces of the house above stairs. The footman led her through corridors she'd only glimpsed during her duties, past paintings of austere ancestors and tall windows that framed the rain-swept grounds in sheets of gray light. Her shoes, practical and worn, seemed to echo too loudly on the polished floors, despite the thick runners meant to muffle such sounds. Every step took her further from the world she knew, the world where she understood her place and purpose, and closer to something that made her pulse race with a fear that was not entirely unpleasant. The small drawing room was not small by any reasonable measure, but it was intimate compared to the grand, formal spaces she'd heard the other servants describe. A fire burned in the hearth, its light dancing across walls papered in deep green silk. The furniture was elegant, but comfortable, chosen for actual use rather than display. And there, standing before the window with his back to the door, was the Duke of Ashford himself. "Your Grace," the footman announced, "the cook you requested." The Duke did not turn immediately. He stood so still that for a moment Thea wondered if he'd heard them at all. His frame was tall, his shoulders broad beneath the perfectly tailored coat that spoke of London's finest craftsmanship, even here in his self-imposed exile. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, touching his collar in a way that suggested he dismissed his valet's gentle suggestions for a trim. When he finally did turn, the firelight caught his face, and Thea had to force herself to maintain the downcast eyes Mrs. Holloway had instructed, because what she'd glimpsed in that moment was almost too much to bear. Beauty carved by suffering, aristocratic features made somehow more compelling by the shadows beneath his eyes, the hard set of his jaw, the way his mouth seemed to have forgotten how to form any expression but coldness. "Leave us," he said to the footman, his voice low and carrying an authority that was born rather than learned. The door closed with a soft click, and Thea found herself alone with a duke for the first time in her life, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Thea kept her eyes on the carpet beneath her feet, a beautiful Persian weave that had probably cost more than her family's farm would earn in a decade, and tried to quiet her breathing, tried to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. "Look at me." The command was soft, but absolute. Thea's head lifted almost of its own accord, and she found herself meeting the Duke's gaze directly. His eyes were gray, she realized, like the winter sea, like the rain that still beat against the windows, like granite worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. They were also, she saw with a shock that went through her like lightning, rimmed with red, as though he'd been weeping or had not slept properly in weeks. Perhaps both. "You cooked the meal that was brought to me this evening," he said. It was not a question, but Thea nodded anyway. "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" The single word hung in the air between them, and Thea understood that he was asking something far deeper than the surface question suggested. She could have said she was ordered to, which was true. She could have claimed it was simply her duty, which would have been the safe answer. Instead, with a rashness that surprised even herself, she told him the truth. "Because I know what it is to grieve, Your Grace. And I know that sometimes grief steals not just appetite, but the will to continue." I hoped that something simple, something honest, might reach past the grief in a way that elegance could not. His expression shifted, something flickering behind those granite eyes that might have been surprise or might have been anger. "You know nothing of my grief." "No, Your Grace. You're quite right. I know nothing of what it is to be betrayed before all of society, to have one's honor and heart broken simultaneously in view of the world. My griefs are small and common." She should have stopped there, should have apologized and retreated, but the words kept coming, pulled from some deep well of empathy she hadn't known she possessed. "But I know what it is to lose something precious, to have the world continue turning when it should have stopped, to find that food tastes of nothing, that daylight brings no relief, that every moment of continued existence feels like a betrayal of what was lost." She was speaking of her mother, but she could see in his face that he heard something else, something that resonated with his own particular anguish. The mask of cold aristocratic control slipped for just a moment, and beneath it, she glimpsed raw pain, the kind that had no outlet, no acceptable expression for a man of his station. "The meal," he said, and his voice had roughened, "was the first thing I've tasted, truly tasted, since I returned to Ashford. The first thing that didn't feel like ash in my mouth, like punishment for the crime of still drawing breath." Thea felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. To cry in front of a duke would be unforgivable, even if those tears were for his suffering and not her own. "I'm glad, Your Grace. Truly glad." He moved closer then, and Thea had to fight the urge to step back, to maintain the proper distance between their stations. But he stopped several feet away, and she realized he was studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as though he could see through to every thought she'd ever harbored, every secret she'd kept. "What is your name?" "Thea Winters, Your Grace. I'm a scullery maid here." "A scullery maid," he repeated, and something that might have been bitter amusement touched the corners of his mouth. "Not a trained cook, not someone hired specifically for culinary skill. A scullery maid who washes dishes and happened to know how to make a man taste life again. I learned from my mother, Your Grace. She believed that food prepared with care could heal more than just hunger. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. Does she still cook for your family?" "She passed, Your Grace, 3 years ago this spring. A fever took her when the winter had been hard, and we'd all been weakened by it." "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of genuine feeling that surprised her. This man, who had every reason to be consumed by his own suffering, had somehow found space to acknowledge hers. "Thank you, Your Grace. She taught me well before she left us. I try to honor that teaching." He turned back to the window, and for a long moment she thought he might dismiss her, that this strange interview had reached its natural conclusion. But when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, something almost hesitant, as though he were venturing into uncertain territory. "I find myself in an unusual position, Miss Winters. My staff, despite their considerable training and expense, have been unable to prepare anything I can stomach for 3 weeks. You, with your simple meal and your mother's wisdom, managed it in an evening." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I would like you to prepare my meals going forward. All of them. You'll be elevated from scullery maid to my personal cook, with appropriate quarters and compensation." Thea's mind reeled. Personal cook to a duke. It was unheard of, impossible. "Your Grace, I'm not qualified. You're the only one who's succeeded where everyone else has failed. That seems qualification enough." He turned back to face her, and now his expression had hardened again into something more like command. "Unless you wish to refuse?" No, Your Grace, I'm honored. Truly honored. I want to be certain you understand that I'm not a chef. I don't know French preparations or elaborate presentations. I only know how to cook the way my mother taught me, the way my grandmother taught her. Simple food, honest food." "That," he said, and for the first time she heard something almost like warmth in his voice, "is precisely what I require." Over the following days, Thea's world transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. She was given a small room near the kitchens, not in the attics with the other maids, but in a space that had previously been used for the still room, with its own narrow window overlooking the kitchen gardens. Her duties were singular and strange. 3 times a day, she was to prepare a meal for the Duke of Ashford, following no menu, no prescribed recipes, only her instinct and her mother's teachings. She made porridge in the mornings, thick with cream and honey, topped with apples cooked soft with cinnamon. For noon meals, she prepared soups, hearty lentil with ham, potato with leeks, chicken with vegetables that reminded her of Sunday dinners before her mother died. In the evenings, she cooked the meals her family would have recognized: roasted meats with vegetables, meat pies with thick gravy, fish when the fishmonger came from the coast, always accompanied by bread. She learned to bake herself, finding that the process of kneading dough had its own meditative quality. The trays came back less full each day, and then, after a week, they began coming back empty. She never saw the Duke during these meals. They were delivered by footmen, returned by footmen. The distance between the kitchen where she worked and the rooms where he took his solitary meals maintained by the invisible but rigid structures of the household hierarchy. But she felt his presence in the empty plates, in the way the kitchen staff began to treat her with a mixture of respect and bewilderment, in the knowledge that somehow, impossibly, she was reaching him through the language of food when nothing else could. It was Mrs. Holloway who brought her the first strange request. "His Grace has asked," the housekeeper said, her tone suggesting she found the whole thing rather extraordinary, "if you might prepare the beef stew again, the one from your first night cooking for him." Thea had felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the kitchen fires. He'd remembered, of all the meals she'd prepared in the days since, he'd thought of that first one, the one made from instinct and hope and a scullery maid's presumption. She made the stew, taking even more care than she had the first time, and when the tray returned that evening, there was something else with it. A note, folded small and sealed with wax that bore the Duke's crest. Her hands had trembled as she opened it. aware that she was probably transgressing some unspoken rule by even touching paper that bore his personal seal. The handwriting was strong, masculine, each letter formed with precision that spoke of excellent education and iron control. The meal was as I remembered. Thank you. L.B. She pressed the note to her chest like a talisman, then carefully hid it in the small trunk where she kept her few personal possessions. It was foolish, she knew, to treasure 3 sentences from a duke. Foolish and dangerous, because such treasuring implied a connection that could not exist between their worlds. But she kept it anyway, and when she lay in her narrow bed that night, she found herself wondering what he'd looked like as he wrote those words, whether his hand had hesitated over the page, whether he'd struggled with the impulse to say more, or felt relief at saying even that much. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. She cooked. He ate. Sometimes there were requests, the stew again, or the chicken soup, or the apple porridge that reminded him, he said in another brief note, of breakfasts from his childhood at his family's northern estate. She began to understand his preferences, the subtle ways his appetite shifted with his moods. On days when the rain was particularly fierce, he wanted heavier fare, food that anchored him to warmth and safety. On days when the sun broke through, he preferred lighter meals, fish and vegetables that suggested the possibility of renewal. She never asked the footman about him, though she desperately wanted to. It seemed an invasion of the fragile trust that was building between them through the medium of her cooking. But she listened when the other servants talked, piecing together an image of a man whose life had been shattered by betrayal and who was slowly, painfully, beginning to reassemble himself in the privacy of his exile from society. They said he'd begun riding again, not with the reckless desperation of those first weeks, but with purpose, exploring the boundaries of his estate. They said he'd resumed correspondence with his steward, taking interest once more in the management of his lands. They said he'd been heard laughing, actually laughing, at something one of the stable boys had said about a particularly stubborn horse. And they said, in whispers that made Thea's stomach twist with feelings she couldn't name, that Lady Arabella Weatherby had sent letters, begging for forgiveness, claiming she'd been coerced by Lord Edmund, that it had all been a terrible mistake. The Duke had sent every letter back unopened. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after she'd first prepared a meal for him, that everything changed. Thea was in the kitchen garden, selecting herbs for the day's cooking, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the gardeners, or perhaps Mrs. Holloway, with some instruction, and instead found herself face to face with the Duke of Ashford himself. He was dressed for riding, his tall boots gleaming despite the dampness of the morning, his coat of dark wool perfectly tailored to his frame. But it was his face that struck her. He looked different than he had in the drawing room a month ago. The hollowness had receded from his eyes, color had returned to his cheeks, and though the shadows of suffering had not entirely lifted, they no longer seemed to consume him entirely. Miss Winters. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of courtesy that made her suddenly aware of how improper this was. A duke seeking out a servant in the garden, speaking to her as though they were equals. Your Grace. She curtsied quickly, her basket of herbs clutched against her chest like a shield. I hope the breakfast was satisfactory. If there's something you'd prefer. The breakfast was excellent, as everything you've prepared has been. He paused, and she thought she detected uncertainty in his manner, as though he'd come here with a purpose, but was now questioning the wisdom of it. I wanted to thank you personally. You've done more than provide sustenance. You've given me a reason to want to continue when I'd rather convince myself there was none. Thea felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm glad, Your Grace, truly. But I've only cooked meals. You've done the harder work of choosing to heal. Have I?" His voice carried a bitter edge. "Some days it feels less like choosing and more like being dragged back to life against my will by the stubborn competence of a scullery maid who refused to let me waste away. I think, Your Grace, that no one can be dragged back to life who hasn't decided, somewhere deep down, that they want to be dragged." She was being too familiar, speaking too freely, but something in his presence here, in this informal space where she had authority and he was the intruder, made her bold. "The first time you tasted that meal, truly tasted it, you made a choice. Everything since has been building on that first choice." He studied her for a long moment, and she found she couldn't look away, couldn't maintain the downcast eyes that were supposed to mark her deference. "You speak with remarkable insight for someone so young." "I'm 22, Your Grace, old enough to have known loss and learned something from it." 22. He seemed to be turning the number over in his mind. "I'm 31, 9 years your senior, and yet I suspect you understand more about surviving grief than I've learned in all my allegedly distinguished years. You've had different griefs, Your Grace, public ones, private pain exposed for all the world to dissect and discuss. That must be its own particular torture." Something flashed in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or gratitude that someone had named exactly what he'd endured. "It is. God help me. It is. To be humiliated before one's peers, to have one's broken heart become entertainment for society gossips, to know that every time I show my face in London, I'll be met with pitying looks or barely concealed amusement." He stopped himself, seeming to remember suddenly who he was speaking to, the breach of propriety in confiding such things to a servant. But Thea didn't want him to stop. For reasons she didn't fully understand, she wanted him to continue, to speak the things that clearly poisoned him with their weight. "And what of the betrayal itself?" she asked quietly. "Not the public shame, but the private wound? Does that heal as well?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too far, that he would retreat behind the cold aristocratic mask and dismiss her. But instead, he moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine details of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the precise line of his jaw, the way his eyes held flecks of darker gray within the lighter shade. "I was to marry Lady Arabella," he said, his voice low and rough with suppressed emotion. "Not for love. Our kind rarely have that luxury. But I'd convinced myself we'd build something resembling it over time. She was beautiful, accomplished, exactly the sort of duchess society expected me to choose. I thought I was being responsible, choosing duty over romantic fancy. And then I found her in Edmund's arms, and I realized that duty is cold comfort when the woman you've committed your life to has already given her passion to another." "Did you love her?" Thea asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "I thought I did. Now I wonder if I loved the idea of her, the future we were supposed to build, the alliance our families had planned since we were children. I wonder if I ever knew her at all, or if I simply saw what I wanted to see." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The greatest humiliation isn't even the betrayal itself. It's realizing I was willing to give my life to a phantom, a carefully constructed image that bore little resemblance to the reality." "Then perhaps," Thea said carefully, aware she was treading on dangerous ground, but unable to stop herself, "perhaps the betrayal, as painful as it was, saved you from a worse fate. A lifetime of discovering, piece by piece, that you'd bound yourself to someone who could never truly be yours." He stared at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, some subtle realignment of understanding. You make it sound almost like a gift. Not a gift. A wound. But wounds, properly tended, can heal stronger than the flesh around them. And sometimes, they teach us things we needed to learn, even when the learning costs everything we thought we wanted. The silence that fell between them was different than before, not uncomfortable, but weighted with significance, as though they'd crossed some invisible boundary and found themselves in new territory, where the rules of their respective positions held less sway than the simple fact of their shared humanity. "Walk with me," he said suddenly, gesturing toward the path that led deeper into the gardens. "That is, if you can spare the time from your duties." Thea knew she should refuse, knew that walking alone with the Duke would be seen as presumptuous at best, dangerous at worst. The other servants would talk, and talk among servants had a way of reaching ears it shouldn't. But she found herself nodding, setting her basket down on the stone bench near the herb garden, and falling into step beside him as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They walked in silence at first, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, the morning sun breaking through clouds that had dominated the sky for weeks. The gardens at Ashford were magnificent, Thea realized, seeing them properly for the first time. Carefully tended beds of roses just beginning to bud, topiary shaped into elegant forms, fountain pools where goldfish flashed orange beneath the surface. "Tell me about your family," the Duke said as they passed through an archway of climbing roses. "You mentioned your mother, your father. Brothers?" "2 brothers, Your Grace. Thomas is 18, works with my father on the farm, and James is 14. Still helps with the household and studies, when the vicar has time to teach him. My father, he took my mother's death hard, as I mentioned. But he's better now, especially since Thomas has proven himself capable of managing much of the farm work. And you send money home from your wages here." It wasn't a question, but Thea nodded anyway. "As much as I can spare. With the elevation in position you gave me, I'm able to send more. It helps. You're a good daughter." "I try to be. My mother would have expected no less." They turned into a more secluded section of the garden, where a small stone pavilion overlooked a pond, thick with water lilies. The Duke stopped there, leaning against one of the columns, his gaze distant as though seeing something far beyond the present moment. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said. About wounds healing stronger. About betrayal perhaps saving me from a worse fate." He turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You've given me back my appetite, Miss Winters. Not just for food, but for the possibility of continuing. For the first time since the scandal, I find myself wanting to wake in the morning, curious what you'll prepare, how it will taste, what small pleasure might be found in something as simple as a well-cooked meal. I'm glad, Your Grace. But you've also given me something more dangerous." His voice had dropped lower, and Thea felt her heart begin to race in her chest. "You've reminded me that there are people in this world who see past titles and expectations to the wounded creature beneath, who offer care not because it's required, but because they possess genuine compassion. Your Grace, Lucienne." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading outward in ways neither could fully control. "When we're alone, I want you to call me Lucian. I'm weary of being Your Grace, of carrying that weight of expectation and formality even in my own home." I couldn't possibly. But even as she protested, she felt the word settling into her mind, trying itself on for size. Lucian. It suited him, this man who'd shown her his vulnerability, who'd trusted her with his grief. "You could. You can. I'm asking you to." He moved closer, and Thea found herself backed against the column of the pavilion, trapped not by force, but by the magnetic pull of his presence. "Say it." Just once. Let me hear my name spoken by someone who sees me rather than my position. Lucien. The name emerged as barely more than a whisper, but she saw the effect it had on him, the way his eyes darkened, the way his breath seemed to catch. And she felt her own response to speaking it, the dangerous intimacy of claiming this small familiarity with a man so far above her station. Again. Lucien. Stronger this time, more certain, and with it came the acknowledgement of what was building between them, something that had begun with a bowl of stew and had grown into connection far more complex than either had anticipated. He reached out then, his hand hovering near her face, as though seeking permission before making contact. When she didn't pull away, his fingers gently tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her cap behind her ear. The touch was fleeting, proper, but it burned through her like fire, awakening feelings she'd never allowed herself to explore. "This is madness," he said, but he didn't move away. "You're a servant in my household. I'm a duke. Even speaking like this is a breach of every rule governing our respective worlds." "I know." Her voice was steady despite the chaos of her emotions. "I know it's impossible, but I also know that in this moment, in this garden, we're simply two people who found unexpected connection in the midst of grief and recovery. And after this moment," his question carried the weight of all the obstacles between them, class, propriety, the vast gulf of privilege and expectation. "After this moment, I'll go back to being your cook. You'll go back to being the Duke of Ashford. We'll maintain the proper distance, the appropriate formality." She paused, gathering courage. "But perhaps we'll both know that somewhere beneath all those roles and rules, we've understood each other in a way that rarely happens between any two people, regardless of their stations." He studied her face as though memorizing it, his hand still resting against her cheek with a tenderness that made her ache. "You're remarkably wise for a scullery maid." "I'm not a scullery maid anymore. Remember, you elevated me." "So I did." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "I seem to have a habit of making impulsive decisions around you, Miss Winters." "Thea." It was only fair, after he'd given her permission to use his name. "If we're to break rules, we might as well be thorough about it." "Thea." He said it slowly, testing the feel of it. "It suits you, strong and simple and true." They stood there for a moment longer, caught in the strange space between what was possible and what was permitted, both knowing they were balanced on the edge of something that could either remain a beautiful but constrained moment, or tip over into territory from which there would be no return to the safety of their prescribed roles. It was the sound of voices from the main garden path that broke the spell. The Duke, Lucien, stepped back immediately, proper distance reasserting itself even as his eyes held hers, with an intensity that promised this conversation was far from finished. "You should return to your duties," he said, his voice once again carrying the formal tone of master to servant. But there was something in his expression that softened the words, that acknowledged what had passed between them, even as they both retreated behind the necessary masks. "Yes, Your Grace." She curtsied, gathered her scattered composure, and turned to leave. "Thea." His voice stopped her. She looked back to find him still standing in the pavilion, framed by roses and morning light. "Thank you. For the meals. For the conversation. For seeing me." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried back toward the kitchen garden where her basket of herbs waited. But she carried with her the warmth of his touch, the sound of her name in his mouth, and the dangerous knowledge that somewhere in the process of healing his appetite, she'd lost her own heart to a man she could never truly have. The weeks that followed were exquisite torture. Thea continued her duties, preparing 3 meals a day for a duke who now felt far more real than he had when he was simply a title and a tragic story. She poured her growing feelings into the food she cooked, trying to speak through chicken, braised in wine, and bread, warm from the oven, the things she could never say aloud. And Lucian, she thought of him as Lucian now, even when she forced herself to say, "Your Grace," aloud, responded with notes that came with the returned trays more frequently. Small observations about the meals, thanks for particular dishes, and occasionally comments that suggested he understood the language she was speaking through her cooking. The lamb reminded me of spring at my family's estate in Northumberland. I haven't thought of those times in years. Thank you for returning me to them, if only for the space of a meal. Your pastries this morning were lighter than air. I found myself taking my time with breakfast, reluctant to have it end. A dangerous precedent. I've begun to look forward to mealtimes with an anticipation that borders on unseemly. My steward commented this morning that I seem more myself than I've been in months. I told him the Ashford air was finally agreeing with me. We both knew the truth was more complex. She kept every note, reading them until she had them memorized, trying to decipher every word for hidden meaning, for signs that what she felt might possibly be returned in some measure. They did not speak privately again for nearly a fortnight. When they did encounter each other in the corridors or grounds, propriety was rigidly maintained. A nod of acknowledgement, perhaps a brief word about the day's menu or some household matter. Nothing that would raise suspicion among the ever-watchful staff. But Thea felt his presence in the house like a physical thing. She knew when he was in the library, because the servants' gossip carried through the kitchen. She knew when he rode out across the estate, because she would watch from her window until he returned, relief flooding through her each time he came back safe. She knew when he received correspondence from London, because the meals that followed were always harder for him to finish, as though news from the world beyond Ashford stole his regained appetite. It was Mrs. Holloway who brought the news that changed everything. "There's to be a dinner party," the housekeeper announced one morning, her face flushed with the excitement of organizing such an event after months of the household being closed to visitors. 3 weeks hence, His Grace has invited several of his closest friends from London, gentlemen he's known since his school days, and their wives. Intimate gathering, only 8 guests, but it means we'll need to prepare a formal dinner of at least 7 courses. Thea's heart sank. A formal dinner meant professional cooking far beyond her simple methods. "Perhaps we should hire additional help, a trained chef from London?" His Grace was quite specific in his instructions. Mrs. Holloway looked at Thea with an expression caught between concern and something that might have been matchmaking speculation. "He wants you to prepare the meal, all of it. Says he'll not have his guests eating food prepared by strangers when he has a perfectly capable cook in residence." The kitchen erupted in murmurs of concern. A formal dinner prepared by a former scullery maid? It was scandalous, inappropriate, setting the household up for humiliation when Thea inevitably failed to meet the expectations of aristocratic palates accustomed to the finest culinary arts. But beneath the anxiety, Thea felt something else, a fierce determination not to fail him, not to let his confidence in her prove misplaced. And more than that, a desperate need to understand why he would put her in such a position. Was it trust in her abilities? Or was it something else? A way of keeping her present, central, necessary to the evening, in a way that went beyond the food itself? The note came that afternoon, delivered not with a meal tray, but by one of the Duke's personal footmen, who handed it to her with an expression suggesting he knew exactly how irregular this all was. "Thea, I know I'm asking the impossible. A formal dinner is far beyond anything you've prepared before, but I find I cannot stomach the thought of sitting through an evening of forced social pleasantries while eating food prepared by strangers. I need something real, I need your food, your care, your honesty made tangible in the meal we'll share. If you're willing to attempt this, I promise to make my expectations clear and to provide whatever assistance you need. If you feel it's too much, I'll understand, and we'll make other arrangements. But know that I hope, rather desperately, that you'll say yes." She read the note 3 times, her fingers trembling. The subtext was clear. He was creating a situation that required her presence, her involvement, that would bind them together in the planning and execution of this event. It was dangerous and beautiful, and possibly disastrous. She should refuse, should protect herself from the pain that would inevitably come from deepening a connection that could never be acknowledged publicly, never evolve beyond these stolen moments and carefully worded notes. Instead, she found herself in the library that evening, where she'd been told His Grace would be expecting her report on whether she'd accept the challenge. He stood when she entered, a courtesy that no duke should show a servant. "Thea, thank you for coming." "Your Grace." She curtsied, maintaining the formality even though they were alone. "I've come to discuss the dinner party." "Will you attempt it?" His voice carried an uncertainty that she'd never heard before, as though her answer mattered far more than it should. "I'll attempt it." She saw relief flood his features and felt an answering warmth in her chest. "Though I'll need your help. I don't know what's expected for such an event, what should be served or in what order. Then we'll plan it together." He gestured to the large desk where papers were spread out. "I took the liberty of drafting some possibilities, traditional courses that I think could be adapted to your style of cooking." They spent the next hour bent over the desk together, their heads close as they discussed options. Soup to start. She suggested a butternut squash with sage and cream that could be elegant, but remained true to her methods. Fish course. Dover sole, simply prepared with butter and lemon. Remove. A roast of beef with Yorkshire pudding and seasonal vegetables. Savory. Cheese and fruit, arranged artfully. And for dessert, she proposed a trifle. Layers of her homemade sponge cake, custard, and fruit that would look impressive while remaining something she could actually execute successfully. As they worked, their hands occasionally brushed over the papers, and each touch felt like a small current of electricity. Lucian described the guests who would be attending: Lord William Stirling and his wife Charlotte, Sir James Ashford, a distant cousin, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Bellamy, and Lord Henry Cavendish, with his new wife Sophia. "They're good people," Lucian said, his voice carrying genuine affection. "Friends who wrote to me after the scandal, offering support without pity, who invited me to their estates when London became unbearable. I've been meaning to thank them properly, and I thought." He paused, then met her eyes directly. "I thought they should meet the person who's actually saved me. Not directly, of course. You'll be in the kitchen, separate from the party itself, but they'll taste your food, and in tasting it, they'll understand something of why I've been able to find my way back from the edge. You give me too much credit, Your Grace. Lucienne. We're alone. Lucienne." The name felt more natural each time she spoke it. "You've done the real work of healing. I've only provided sustenance. You've provided hope." He reached across the desk and took her hand, a gesture so bold and unexpected that she gasped. "Do you know what it means to me that you're willing to do this? To put yourself in a position where you might fail spectacularly in service of helping me reconnect with the few people in society I still trust?" "I know what it means to want to be worthy of someone's trust," she said quietly. "And I know that I would attempt far more difficult things than cooking a dinner party if you asked it of me." His grip on her hand tightened. "I should not have asked this of you. It's unfair, putting you in this position. If the meal is judged inadequate by aristocratic standards, it will reflect poorly on you. and I could never forgive myself for that. Then I won't let it be inadequate. She squeezed his hand in return, drawing strength from the contact, even as she knew they were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. I'll make you proud, Lucian. I promise. They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped across the desk covered in dinner plans, the library quiet around them, except for the tick of the clock and the crackle of the fire. And Thea thought that if she could freeze time, she would choose this moment, the two of them together, planning something beautiful, connected by touch and trust, and the unspoken feelings that grew stronger with each passing day. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. Thea spent hours planning every detail, testing recipes, adjusting flavors, trying to elevate her simple cooking into something that could sit comfortably in a formal dining room without losing the essential honesty that made her food distinctive. The other kitchen staff, initially skeptical, gradually came to support her efforts, caught up in the challenge of pulling off something extraordinary with their newly elevated colleague. Lucian was involved in ways that far exceeded any normal master's interest in his kitchen. He came by regularly, too regularly, the other servants began to notice, to taste what Thea was testing, to offer suggestions, to simply watch her work with an intensity that made her hands unsteady and her heart race. "You have flour on your cheek," he said one afternoon, and before she could wipe it away, he'd reached out to do it himself, his thumb brushing across her skin with a tenderness that stole her breath. "Your Grace," she'd whispered, aware of Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes from across the kitchen. "People are watching. Let them watch." But he'd stepped back anyway, propriety reasserting itself, even as his eyes told her he cared nothing for propriety when it came to her. The night of the dinner party arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring evening that felt like a gift after months of rain and cold. Thea had been in the kitchen since before dawn, overseeing every detail, checking and rechecking that everything was prepared and ready. Her hands shook as she ladled the butternut squash soup into fine porcelain bowls, garnishing each with a delicate drizzle of cream and a few crispy sage leaves. This was it, the moment when her simple cooking would be judged by people who dined in the finest houses in England, who knew what aristocratic food should taste like. As the first course was sent up, she found herself pacing the kitchen, unable to settle, imagining the guests' faces as they tasted her soup. Would they find it too simple? Too countrified? Would they wonder why the Duke of Ashford had such an unsophisticated cook? The footman returned with empty bowls. "Well," Mrs. Holloway demanded, "what did they say?" The footman's face broke into a smile. "Lady Charlotte asked for the recipe. Lord Stirling said it was the finest soup he'd tasted outside Paris. And His Grace." The footman paused significantly. "His Grace looked happier than I've ever seen him." Course after course went up, and course after course came back empty. The Dover sole was pronounced delicate and perfect. The roast beef brought actual applause from the dining room. The trifle inspired Lord Cavendish to declare that his London chef should be worried for his position. But it was the note that came down with the dessert plates that made Thea's eyes fill with tears. They love your food. But more importantly, they love seeing me able to enjoy it. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for giving me back, not just my appetite, but my ability to share pleasure with friends. You are extraordinary." She pressed the note to her chest, and Mrs. Holloway, seeing it, gave her a look that combined knowing sympathy with warning concern. "Be careful, girl," the housekeeper said quietly. "Whatever's growing between you and His Grace, it can only end in heartbreak. Men like him don't marry women like us, no matter how well we cook or how much they might care for us in the moment." "I know," Thea whispered. "I know it's impossible." Knowing it's impossible doesn't always stop the heart from wanting it anyway. As the guests departed near midnight, praising the meal effusively and promising to return soon, Thea cleaned the kitchen with hands that felt numb with exhaustion and emotion. The dinner had been a triumph, but the triumph felt hollow because it changed nothing fundamental about her situation. She was still a servant. He was still a duke. And no amount of perfectly prepared soup could bridge that chasm. She was just hanging up her apron when the kitchen door opened, and Lucian himself walked in, still dressed in his evening clothes, looking impossibly handsome and heartbreakingly out of place in this domain of copper pots and scrubbed wooden tables. "Your Grace!" Mrs. Holloway started forward in alarm. "You shouldn't be. I'd like a word with Miss Winters. Alone, please." The housekeeper's face went through a series of complicated expressions: disapproval, worry, resignation, and finally, surprising sympathy. "Of course, Your Grace. I'll just be in the next room if needed." When they were alone, Lucian moved toward Thea with purpose, and she found herself backed against the kitchen table, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he must hear it. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My friends were enchanted. They spent the entire evening telling me how fortunate I was to have discovered such a talented cook. If only they knew." Knew what? Though she thought she understood, needed to hear him say it. That the fortune isn't the quality of the food. It's having found you, a woman who saw past my title to my suffering, who fed me not just meals, but hope, who became— He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Who became essential to me in ways I never expected, and am certainly not supposed to feel. Lucien." Her voice broke on his name. "This is impossible. You know it's impossible." "I know what society would say is impossible. But standing here, looking at you with flour still dusting your hair and exhaustion in your eyes after you spent all day creating beauty for my benefit, I find I care remarkably little about what society thinks. But you should care. You're a duke. Your position, your responsibilities. My position has brought me nothing but misery. My responsibilities required me to almost marry a woman who was in love with another man. Perhaps it's time I chose something for myself. Consequences be damned." "What are you saying?" She could barely breathe, could barely process what seemed to be happening. "I'm saying that I'm in love with you." The words fell between them like stones, dropped into still water, their ripples spreading outward in ever-widening circles. "I'm saying that somewhere between the first meal you cooked for me and tonight's triumph, you became the person I think of when I wake, the face I imagine when I'm riding across the estate, the reason I want to continue building a life here, rather than hiding from the world. You can't love me." But even as she said it, hope bloomed fierce and wild in her chest. "I'm a woman of intelligence, compassion, strength, and remarkable skill. A woman who saved me when I'd given up on being saved. A woman I love beyond reason or propriety." He took her hands in his, and she felt herself trembling. "I know what I'm asking is impossible by conventional standards. I know there are 1,000 reasons why a duke and a former scullery maid cannot be together. But Thea, I've tried living by conventional standards, and it nearly destroyed me. I'd rather face scandal with you than propriety with anyone else. Your friends, your family, society, they'll never accept me. My friends loved you tonight without even meeting you. My family—" He paused. "My family will come around or they won't. I find I'm surprisingly willing to risk their disapproval for the chance of genuine happiness. And if they don't come around, if you're ostracized from society, if your children—" She stopped, blushing at the presumption. But he smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she'd seen from him. "My children, our children, if you'll have me, will be raised knowing that honor and courage, sometimes mean choosing love over obligation, truth over appearance. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing kisses to her knuckles. Marry me, Thea. Let me spend the rest of my life being worthy of the gift you've given me. Let me feed your soul the way you've fed mine. She should say no, should protect them both from the difficult path that lay ahead if she accepted. Should think of all the practical obstacles, the social consequences, the 1,000 ways this could end in regret. Instead, she found herself saying, yes, God help me. Yes. He pulled her into his arms then, propriety abandoned entirely, and kissed her with a passion that had been building since that first day in the drawing room, since that morning in the garden, since every meal shared across the distance of their positions. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his, as though she could somehow fuse them together by force of will alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thea found herself laughing and crying simultaneously. This is mad. Absolutely mad. The best things usually are. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I'll speak to the Archbishop for a special license. We'll marry quietly here at Ashford. My friends will stand with us. They'll be shocked, certainly, but they'll support me. They saw tonight what you're capable of creating. They'll understand. And Lady Arabella? Lord Edmund? When they hear of this, his expression hardened for just a moment. Let them hear. Let them know that their betrayal led me to something far more precious than anything they destroyed. You are my revenge, Thea. The best possible revenge. A life of genuine happiness built from the ruins of their treachery. In the weeks that followed, Lucian was true to his word. He obtained the special license. He informed his closest friends, who were indeed shocked, but, as he'd predicted, rallied around him with surprising warmth. He wrote to his family, his mother, his sisters, his various aristocratic relations, explaining his decision and making clear that while he hoped for their acceptance, he would proceed with or without it. The servants' hall buzzed with gossip that ranged from romantic to scandalous to deeply concerned for Thea's welfare. Mrs. Holloway took her aside one evening and said quietly, I hope you know what you're doing, girl. The life you're choosing won't be easy. I know, Thea replied. But the alternative, living without him, always wondering what might have been, that would be harder still. They were married on a Tuesday morning in late spring, in the small chapel on the Ashford estate. Lord Stirling and his wife Charlotte stood as witnesses, along with Mr. and Mrs. Bellamy. Thea wore a simple dress of cream silk that Lady Charlotte had insisted on providing, and carried wildflowers from the estate's meadows. Lucian wore his finest coat and looked at her throughout the ceremony as though she were the answer to every question he'd ever asked. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Duke and Duchess of Ashford, Thea felt the weight of impossibility transform into possibility, felt the boundaries that had separated them dissolve into nothing more than outdated notions that no longer had any power over their chosen future. The wedding breakfast was held in the small dining room, and Thea, now her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford, though she could barely comprehend it, had prepared it herself, refusing offers of help. She made all of Lucian's favorites, all the dishes that had marked their journey from Duke and scullery maid to husband and wife, the beef stew that had started everything, the porridge with apples and cinnamon, the bread she'd learned to bake just for him. Simple food, honest food, food that spoke of care and love, and the power of one person reaching another through the most basic of human needs. As they ate, surrounded by the few friends who'd chosen to support them, Lucien took her hand and raised his glass. To my wife, he said, his voice thick with emotion, who fed me when I was starving, who saw me when I'd become invisible even to myself, who had the courage to bridge an impossible distance, and the wisdom to know that some things are more important than social propriety. You are my revenge and my redemption, my greatest scandal and my truest love. To the Duke and Duchess, Lord Stirling added, may your unconventional beginning lead to an extraordinary life. They drank, and Thea felt tears slip down her cheeks even as she smiled. This was her life now, a life she'd never imagined, earned not through birth or status, but through simple acts of compassion that had spiraled into connection far deeper than either had anticipated. That evening, as they stood together in the window of what was now their shared bedchamber, looking out over the estate that stretched to the horizon, Lucien wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. Do you know what I was thinking? He murmured. That first night when I tasted your stew. When I actually tasted it. I mean, when food stopped being ash and started being real again. What were you thinking? I was thinking that I wanted to live long enough to thank whoever had cooked it. Such a small goal, such a modest ambition, to simply survive until I could express gratitude. And now, here we are, married, bound together for life, and I find my ambitions have grown somewhat larger. Oh? And what are your ambitions now, Your Grace? He turned her in his arms so she faced him, his eyes serious despite his smile. To spend every day for the rest of my life, making sure you never regret the impossible choice you made. To build with you a family, a home, a life that stands as proof that the heart knows wisdom the world's conventions never will. To grow old, tasting every meal you cook, and knowing that the greatest sustenance I receive is not the food itself, but the love with which you prepare it. She reached up to touch his face, this man who'd started as a cold and broken duke, and had become her husband, her future, her improbable love. Those seem like worthy ambitions, Lucien. Perhaps we can achieve them together. Together, he agreed, and kissed her as the sun set over Ashford Hall, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless their union despite all the conventions they'd shattered to create it. In the months and years that followed, society did indeed gossip about the Duke of Ashford and his scandalous marriage to a former servant. Some doors closed to them, some invitations ceased to arrive, some relations maintained a cold distance that would never thaw. But other doors opened, doors to genuine connection, to friendships based on mutual respect rather than social positioning, to a life built on truth rather than appearance. Thea learned to navigate her new position with grace, bringing to her role as Duchess the same practical wisdom and compassion that had marked her time as a scullery maid. She continued to cook, much to the fascination of visiting guests, and the dinners at Ashford Hall became famous throughout the county for their unusual combination of elegant simplicity and genuine warmth. She and Lucien had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, whom they raised with an understanding that true nobility lay not in title, but in character, not in blind adherence to social rules, but in the courage to choose kindness, honesty, and love even when such choices were difficult. And every year on their anniversary, Lucien would request the same meal that had started everything: a simple beef stew, thick slices of bread, and the knowledge that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the smallest acts of care. That healing can taste like soup, that love can grow from the most unlikely soil, that a duke and a scullery maid can find in each other not just solace from their separate griefs, but the courage to build something new together, something that honored their pasts while refusing to be bound by them. In the end, their revenge against those who'd wounded them was not cruelty or social destruction, but happiness. Thorough, undeniable, impossible happiness that proved, day after day and meal after meal, that genuine connection transcends every boundary society erects to keep people in their designated places. And that, Thea thought as she watched her husband play with their children in the garden while dinner simmered on the stove, was the sweetest revenge of all.